Welcome to the program. My guest is Kirt von Daacke. Kirt teaches in the Department of History at the University of Virginia, and he is a member of the President's Commission on Slavery at UVA. Kirt, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We need to get an update on this commission.
Absolutely.
And explore the work that y'all are doing. Let's begin by reminding people what this commission is in the first place. President Sullivan at UVA created this very special group to do what?
In 2013, she created the commission to basically research the history of slavery and enslavement at the University of Virginia, prepare a detailed report about it, and recommend appropriate memorialization. And the commission's 26 members has been working pretty doggedly for the past 3 years on a whole bunch of fronts. And we have, I think, expanded what we take to mean by appropriate memorialization. We've looked at this as a really progressive project that involves continuous community outreach and engagement. This is both building memorials, it's putting in interpretive signage, it's rethinking the way we organically tell the story about the history of UVA in such a way that it includes this story of slavery and the enslaved. So it's been pretty exciting 3 years.
And the big picture, I guess, is in embracing this new, more progressive, more historically accurate, let's say, narrative of UVA, we're really doing that about America too.
Yes, that's, we have looked at this from the get-go as the story about slavery at UVA is a way to use the University of Virginia and Charlottesville, Albemarle as it's a case study for understanding how this story plays out before the Civil War and how the ideas that developed before the Civil War actually come to, in some profound ways, shape our world long after 1865.
Yeah. What's the impetus for the president to do something like this? What was going on? What happened?
This is one of my favorite stories. I think this comes about because of energy at UVA amongst students and faculty, that there are a few courses being run by professors looking into this and sending students on research projects. Two people in particular, Phyllis Loeffler and Frank Dukes, were really instrumental in pushing students to do this work. So students did the work, and then in 2007, the General Assembly issued a statement of regret for slavery. The Board of Visitors followed suit, and the first memorial to the enslaved was installed in the southwest corner of the rotunda at the entrance to the underground cryptoporticus. And students at the time found that memorial insufficient, that it was embedded in the ground, it was turned sideways as a transom, kind of as you go through an arcade. And it only talks about the enslaved laborers as a group of people working to build the university and thus realizing Jefferson's vision for the university. And they thought, if you're going to honor the hundreds of enslaved people who helped build and maintain the university, it needs to be a lot more substantial than that. And I think typical of the University of Virginia,
despite the best effort of that memorial, it sort of comes across as an afterthought.
Yeah, well, and I think it speaks to, right, there's a process of acknowledgement involved in dealing with slavery, and it tends to work that way, that the first effort is sometimes halting, right? It's done with a certain amount of, and I don't know, I wasn't here in 2007, but I imagine it as embarrassment or concern about how this will make the university look. And the students looked at it and went, I think first, well, this is good, this is a start, but we should do so much more. And
credit to the students for pushing.
But they didn't protest. What I love is they did consciousness raising. So they formed a group called Memorial for Enslaved Laborers. And the work of the group was to bring this story to people's attention. And they even ran in 2010 a design competition for a memorial. They knew that memorial, whatever one, wouldn't be chosen, but it was to raise consciousness and get people thinking about how do we appropriately recognize
this history. Is that a UVA student or what?
Yes,
I mean, that's such a great example. They don't necessarily take to the streets with the sign, but they they sit down in a group and have a very intelligent conversation and say, how can we do this?
So I'm proud to be co-chairing this commission now, knowing how it came about. And the second piece of this puzzle is the Idea Fund, which is an alumni fund dedicated to inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And they were
Terrific
instrumental
group.
in putting in the Henry Martin plaque in 2012. So it's the UVA community in a way drives this process, and what we realized as we started our work is that the UVA community includes people well beyond the boundaries of the university precincts, that there are community organizations doing really important work. There are previous kind of scholarly and digital efforts at UVA that speak to this issue about slavery and its legacies here. And we're just looking to keep that moving and I think reshape how we tell our story and how that story is visible on the landscape.
Can you talk a little bit? I want to talk about some specifics of slavery at UVA, but before we get there, put this in context for us, because UVA is far from the only historic university in America that is finally embracing this new challenge to explore a more powerful narrative about its own story. There's a lot of universities that are trying to figure this out too.
There are. In fact, we formed a consortium called Universities Studying Slavery that we spearheaded as a way to bring other universities to the table who are either doing this work or thinking about doing this work. And one of the ideas was, from our own experience, there were a few universities that had preceded us. We looked at what they did, but we operated in a vacuum until we invited those people to the table to join a national advisory board and guide us. And we said we want to do the same for the universities. That group is now 24 universities and growing. It includes universities in the north, it includes one Canadian university, and we've been in dialogue with universities across the Atlantic. This is becoming a movement of schools looking to, I think, really kind of finally acknowledge their history of entanglement and human bondage and come up with creative ways to acknowledge that past and then move to some sense of repair and reconciliation about it.
So when you look at that consortium and the work being done at these other universities, is there some central key takeaway that would point towards some kind of success? Like, well, here's one thing they're all doing, and this is what they need to do.
I don't know if there's one key success other than, much like we've experienced at UVA, it's that there needs to be kind of university level support for the project. There needs to be faculty and students involved. And
we're seeing that at other schools.
We're seeing that at other schools, and they typically start as research projects. And what everyone tends to run into is, if we just do the research, we're going to issue a report or write a book, and it's not going to make, it's not really going to change the world as we know it. So I think the push has been engage the community and come up with new ways to rethink how you tell the story. And our push here, and I think this is where we might be a leader right now, is this needs to be woven into the very fabric of how we talk about our institution. And when you do that, you start to drive a form of culture change, that the students know it when they get here or know it soon after they arrive, instead of figuring out later as an alumni. So I think that's kind of the push. And I think you'd have to talk to folks in the community about how successful we've been, but we've worked really hard to bring community in as active participants in our process and break down the kind of metaphorical walls that separate town and gown.
Which is a very real thing. Even in every university town, but certainly in the history of UVA in Charlottesville. It's been a very real thing. Let's do this. Let's take a quick break, and when we get back, let's look at some specifics of slavery at the University of Virginia, and we'll certainly talk about Thomas Jefferson. You're watching the Coy Barefoot Program. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking with Kirt von Daacke. He's a professor of history in the Corcoran Department of History at the University of Virginia, and he's co-chair of the President's Commission on Slavery at UVA. Kirt, let's talk about Mr. Jefferson. How does Thomas Jefferson, as the creator of the University of Virginia, as the guy who designed it, figured out what was going to be taught, before he died, he was working on where the outhouses would be, where the stables would be. There was no element in the design here that this micromanager truly didn't leave unturned. He really gave thought to everything. What's the thought he gave to the labor of the enslaved at the University of Virginia and its place in the community?
So I think this is kind of a fascinating story, right? Start with the educational piece. He's creating a kind of radical vision for democratic education in the United States on one level, right? This is an unusual experiment, that it's a public university, it's America's first Enlightenment university, but he's building it in the single largest and most important slaveholding state in the United States. He himself is a person who, over the course of his life, owns over 600 people, and he's building it in a county he is designing it and placing it in a county that is over half the population is enslaved. So right at the time the university is being built, it's nearly 10,000 enslaved people in the county. By 1860, it's about 14,000 enslaved people. So how does that figure into this story? Well, it does. That this is, again, an experiment in white male property holding democratic education.
Right.
And written into the landscape he shapes, he knows that his Enlightenment university the garden will not be tilled by the students and the faculty. It will be tilled by the enslaved. And so he creates a landscape where slavery is meant to be sort of partially hidden, right? The serpentine walls would have been about 8 feet tall, and inside those gardens, most of them were used as work yards where the enslaved lived, cooking, right, butchering animals, smoking meat, doing all the kind of work and maintenance to run a university, both working for the dining halls, which we were at the hotels, or working to clean the rooms. Landscaping the ground during the construction of the university, but he designs it to create spaces for white life and learning, which are really the lawns and then the arcade.
What we're looking at right behind
exactly.
me. Yeah.
And then the enslaved are meant to be tucked away in some way. And I think what he's wrestling with, is ambivalent about slavery. And his ambivalence shows up in this design in that he's worried that having students bring their enslaved people to grounds and interact with the enslaved in that master-slave relationship will corrupt them in some way. And I think this is where one of his great
corrupt
failings.
the students.
Yes. They're already corrupted by slavery because this is a slave-holding society. But that's intentional in the design to sort of tuck that aspect away. It doesn't work because...
Let me ask you this. I mean, I don't mean to interrupt you, but
sure.
So in the design of UVA, he really does try to hide the enslaved in much the same way, if you've ever been up to Monticello and you've seen that. That's precisely what he did at Monticello. He wanted to hide the enslaved population literally in the ground below the home. He wanted to remove it from his site as much as possible.
Yeah,
and he's doing the same thing at UVA.
We think so. We think that the way he uses the landscape along the ridgeline that becomes the lawn and Academical Village is designed in such a way to have slavery sort of descending down the hill from the top of the ridgeline and then hidden behind the 8-foot walls. And I think he's also incorporating a certain amount of kind of surveillance in that the pavilions are intentionally designed so that the professor standing at a back window looking out over the garden, this work yard, would have been able to surveil the enslaved working there. So there's even
like an overseer at a plantation.
Like an overseer at a plantation.
Yeah. So what's this element of students bringing their own enslaved people from home?
So this would have been typical, right? Is students
because they were doing that at colleges all across the South,
the country.
right?
And any student who had the money to travel to university and came from a slaveholding family likely would have expected to come with an enslaved person as their servant. Jefferson and the university explicitly disallow this. You're not allowed to bring your enslaved people with you, but again, there are 90 to 150 enslaved people living and working there already. But he does this, I think, out of that fear that doing this will it'll corrupt the students in some way. We're pretty sure that more than once, students in fact show up with their enslaved and then house them and rent them out locally, because there's a very commodified slave rental network that stretches across the state that UVA employs to get the labor it needs to build the university, and then students tap into if they bring their enslaved person and are not allowed to have them on
So
grounds.
it definitely did happen at UVA. Explain something, because I'm sure a lot of people watching are curious about this. We know for a fact that there are colleges and universities at this time period that literally owned human beings.
Yes.
UVA, surprisingly, in Virginia at the time, really didn't embrace that agenda, right?
Yes, they don't, but I think there's two reasons for this.
They don't have to.
One, they don't have to because there's this highly commodified hiring network that allows them to, when you go into the financial records and track this, what you hear is, this is the amount we paid, $100 to rent 3 hands for 2.5 days. Right. You get it down to, this is a hiring market that's very, very commodified that allows you to precisely rent people to do just the exact amount of labor you need. So they can tap into that. It's much more flexible, and financially it keeps the bottom line operating at the university in a way that's really powerful. Two, right, the state simply doesn't fund the university very well, right? This is a university that, as a public experiment, there is no public education in the state, right? There isn't a state government the way we imagine it today. There's a funding problem. I suspect that if the university had been endowed the way it is today in 1819, they would have unthinkingly purchased enslaved people. But they don't for that main reason, that they simply don't have.
And we also have, you look here on the lawn, these big houses where the professors lived, each of those homes had enslaved people that worked for these families.
Yes.
And I shouldn't say worked, but they were forced to work.
And this is what's an unusual story here, that the university, as a renter or owner of the enslaved, taps into the hiring network, but UVA is an outsourcer from the day it opens in 1825. That dining services and boarding services are outsourced to subcontractors who run hotels and manage the rooms assigned to them. Those people, there's usually 3 hotels at most in operation before the Civil War, are typically the largest. I'm going to call them slaveholders. We don't know whether they were renting, owning, or a combination of both. I suspect a combination of both.
Yeah.
They were the single largest slaveholders on grounds before 1865.
The hotel keepers.
The hotel keepers.
Were providing food and cleaning the rooms.
Cleaning the rooms.
Right.
The professors then lived in the pavilions and had their own enslaved people. And when Jefferson dies in 1826, it's UVA faculty show up at the estate sales and purchase some of the enslaved from Monticello.
To then end up at UVA.
End up at UVA. So this goes to this story about community, that you can't tell the story of the university without talking about Charlottesville, Albemarle, Virginia, and even beyond. The story consistently just forces you to leave grounds.
Right, because we're talking about, in many, many cases, we're talking about interconnected family groups. That are related.
Yes, and the hiring network, and this is what's unusual, the hiring network stretches pretty far. We have, and this is 1819, the university rents 9 enslaved people from a man named Pallison Boxley, who's from the east end of Louisa County. So
towards Richmond.
Yeah, towards Richmond, so at least 50 miles from here. At that point, they would have walked here, possibly in coffles, to the university. They work for over a year at the university. While they're here as part of the contract, the university is contractually bound to provide them with clothing. They're given winter clothes. In March 1820, the contract is up. The university is done with their labor. They are sent back almost to Richmond without their clothes. So this hiring network means it stretches a great distance across the state. We can't tell for sure, but there are times when the rental agent appears to be a business concern. So it's entirely likely that the university at times uses slave hiring agents, middlemen in this commodified network. So they're usually located in Richmond, which means the enslaved could come from a Richmond hinterland that's much broader than we're already looking at. But I think it's safe to assume that the enslaved who work here, many of them come from Albemarle and neighboring counties, but the real radius for that group is at least 50, maybe 70 miles.
And again, the takeaway here is that this is a story that the university hasn't told.
Right.
This is a story that the university historically hasn't been interested in telling.
No.
And now, for the first time, we are seeing a very serious, committed, enlightened effort to embrace this narrative.
Absolutely.
What's that narrative going to look like? You talked about historic signage. You've talked about a memorial.
Right.
What's in the works?
So in the works are, and this is building on work we've already done, we're trying to install interpretive panels. This is different than a plaque, right? These tend to be larger, they have graphics, and that often we've been trying to use them in certain examples, say at Gibbons Hall, to tell both an individual story, but situate that in a larger story so you can sort of understand the landscape of enslavement at the university. And so we've done one at Gibbons Hall. We have one at the Restored African American Cemetery just north of the UVA Cemetery. We're working on one on women at the early university for Levering Hall, which is now the home of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Department. We are looking at the Gooch Dillard Cemetery, which has a small plaque and bench located at it, but it's not defined in any way. We've just done an archaeological survey out there and are hoping to install interpretive plaques there. We worked with the Office of the Architect to redesign the Rotunda Visitors Center, which now incorporates the story of slaves and slavery into the story of the building of the university and the maintenance of the university. We're now pushing beyond that. We're looking at, we've hired a memorial design team. They've been in town since December doing community outreach. If you go to our website, slavery.virginia.edu, you can link to Memorial for Enslaved Laborers and take a survey about what you would like the memorial to look at. And again, I think we have April 3rd, we have another community engagement event coming up. And this started with one monumental memorial somewhere on grounds. And I think as it has evolved, I'm hopeful, and again, I can't speak for the design team or where this will end up, but I'm hopeful that we have both a substantial memorial that can be kind of a reflective, contemplative space that honors the life and labor of people long forgotten, and is also sort of where you end up after you've finished the tour of enslaved African Americans around grounds, that you have a place to kind of sit and contemplate and honor their lives. But I would also hope that we're looking at McGuffey Cottage, which is just south and sort of kind of southwest of Pavilion 9. We're hoping to, at some point, turn that into an interpretive center. So sort of a museum about slavery at the university.
That'd be great.
That would then be, we would re-landscape and connect it to the lawn so that we have both something kind of visible on the lawn. And what I think is fascinating is students have asked in all of our memorialization that we make sure that the space is suitable for student gatherings, whether they are commemorative gatherings or protest meetings. They wanted space to do just that. And so
that's really interesting.
My vision is both these memorials, the current evolving spot for the memorial, again, none of this is solidified yet, but this is east of Brooks Hall, kind of along that diagonal walkway that heads to the corner. There's a large triangle of grass, and the most recent design is something that's 80 feet in diameter, echoing the dimensions of the rotunda, that would have a water feature, and of the names that we can recover, the names of the enslaved inscribed upon it. And then we'd have the interpretive center and kind of integrated seating area and gathering space connecting McGuffey Cottage back to the lawn. And then, this is my hope. This isn't yet anything I can confirm will happen. We're really looking at what I would call a distributed memorialization, which is you put up benches, signs, something that kind of disrupts the landscape in ways that that don't necessarily fit with the architecture and design of the university. So a curved granite bench dropped in an alleyway where we can then tell a story about enslavement and kind of build that into the landscape so that both visitors and students, when they come here, are confronted is not really the right word, but as you walk through grounds, this story becomes one that you have to consider in some way.
So in a way, in a very real way, the effort is to unhide
Yes,
what has been so long hidden, but has been right in front of us the whole time.
We describe this as, right, this is a story that's hidden in plain sight,
Yeah.
and what's missing now is contextualization and explanation. So there are still McGuffey Cottages, one of the buildings, the Cracker Box, which is between Levering Hall and Pavilion 10, and a portion of the Muse behind Pavilion 3, right? That's been added on to 2 or 3 times. But those were all external buildings built where the enslaved lived and worked.
The architecture of slavery.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it's all around us, and we want that story to be told. The basements under the lawn rooms, particularly, there are many of them on the east side, we can document that many of those were where the enslaved lived, and we hope to, we're not going to interpret the room, and I think there's a number of reasons for this, but what we'd like to do is, like the Poe room, light one of these basements, glass it off, and put interpretive panels inside explaining what you see. And what you see now is an earthen floored room. You can see evidence that they were plastered at some point. But you also see pipes and wires and cables running through them, a lot of pipes and wires and cables.
Yeah, especially
and
today.
I think there's something sort of beautiful about that, right? These are spaces that have been dedicated to the hidden support of people who live on the lawn since 1825.
So you have the present in conversation with the past in the same space.
And so, we'd like to do that as well and show that this is, again, well, hopefully by 2019 or 2020, a lot of this will be done.
Well, we're going to have you back for an update again. Kirt, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
really
so much for
appreciate it.
having
And
me.
the website again, so folks
Is
can get
slavery.virginia.edu.
slavery.virginia.edu. Thank you, Kirt.
Great, thank you.
Kirt von Daacke is at the University of Virginia in the Corcoran Department of History. You can find the complete archive of this program online at mediaandcitizenship.org. Y'all have a terrific week and be good to each other.